Shout out to Blue Collar Sports TV.
Yo, what is up, guys? Del Boy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully, you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So, this video is a quick preview and prediction for Joe Smith Jr. versus Maxim Vlasov. Now, this fight goes down on the 13th of February, takes place at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, and of course, this fight is for the vacant WBO light heavyweight title. First and foremost, I have to say, I really am looking forward to this fight. On paper, I see this fight as evenly matched. Both guys kind of have contrasting styles, and I believe both guys can cause problems for the other. I see this as a genuine 50-50 fight. And I have to say, I decided to make this prediction video now because ultimately, I'm never really going to be set on a pick for this fight. My mind is going back and forth, so I thought, why not make it now, and I'll lock my pick in. I've got to be honest, as I record this video, I've not even made my pick in my mind, so I'll make my pick at the end of this video, and what I go with, I go with. It's one of those sort of fights. I find this one really hard to call. Joe Smith Jr. is the bookie's favourite, but I'm not entirely convinced, to be honest. I think this is 50-50. But let's briefly talk about the tail of the tape. We shall start with Joe Smith Jr. Now, he has a record of 26 wins, 3 defeats, 0 draws. 21 of those 26 wins coming by way of knockout. Maxim Vlasov has a record of 45 wins, 3 defeats, 0 draws. 26 of those 45 wins coming by way of knockout. Joe Smith Jr. is listed as 6 foot. I can't find his reach anywhere. Maxim Vlasov is listed as 6'3.5" with a 76.5 inch reach. So Maxim Vlasov is 3.5 inches taller, and from what I see, he clearly has some sort of reach advantage over Joe Smith Jr. Joe Smith has relatively good arm length, but from what I see, I'm assuming that Maxim Vlasov has a longer reach from what I see. So yeah, Vlasov is clearly taller than Joe Smith, and it looks like he's got a reach advantage as well. That could play a factor in this fight. Joe Smith Jr. is 31 years old, whereas Maxim Vlasov is 34 years old, and both of these guys are orthodox fighters. So that is the tail of the tape. Now that's out of the way, I guess I'll break down what I believe each guy should do in this fight, and then officially make my prediction for this fight. I guess we shall start with the favourite, Joe Smith Jr. Now, as we know, Joe Smith Jr. is a very aggressive fighter. A leopard doesn't really change its spots. We know he's going to go in there and try and knock out Maxim Vlasov. In recent years, Joe Smith Jr. has improved a lot, in my opinion. Once upon a time, this guy used to be kind of like a basic come-forward puncher with power in both hands. But yeah, in recent times, he's improved his style quite a lot. I think his footwork has improved. He seems to be cutting off a ring a lot better. He's jabbing his way in. And also, I like the way that he varies his punch power these days. Back in the day, Joe Smith Jr. really would load up on every single shot. However, these days, Joe Smith Jr., when he's got his opponents on the ropes or in the corner or stationary, he won't load up on every single punch. He will actually vary the power of his punches in combinations. So maybe the first 2 punches of a combination might be light punches, and then the third will be a big power shot. These sort of improvements going into this fight are pretty key, and he'll need to bring those into this fight because Maxim Vlasov is a awkward, tall, rangy boxer who can do a bit of everything. So Joe Smith Jr. in this fight, he can't be marauding forwards, neglecting that jab. He needs to be using that jab as an offensive weapon, of course, as a point-scoring shot, but also as a way to close the distance. Joe Smith Jr.'s jab has improved leaps and bounds in recent times, and that punch for Joe Smith Jr., the jab, is going to be exceptionally important in this fight. Not only, of course, as a point-scoring shot and even a weapon in itself, because Joe Smith Jr. does have a very hard jab, but he needs to use that jab in order to maneuver Vlasov around the ring, trap him in the corner, trap him against the ropes, and he needs to use that jab in order to set up his offense and cut the ring off. Like I said, in recent times, in the last couple of fights in particular, Joe Smith Jr. has been a lot more consistent with that jab. He's doubled up on it, he's used it to get on the inside, he's used it as a weapon, and he needs to do that in this fight. He can't afford to go back to the old Joe Smith, where he wasn't as consistent with the jab, where he would kind of come forwards and just look for looping power shots. That might not be enough in this fight. Of course, he can always land that big power shot, which renders Maxim Vlasov unconscious, but I think using that jab is going to be a lot more beneficial for Joe Smith Jr. in order to get Vlasov where he wants him and also to get on the inside. So the jab in this fight is going to be exceptionally important for Joe Smith Jr. in order to carry out his pressure game. You know, we all know what Joe Smith Jr. is going to do. He's going to apply pressure. He's going to come forwards. He's going to look for those bombs, but he needs to be a bit more subtle with it. You know, he needs to move his head a bit. He needs to use that jab. He needs to keep covered up, throw a couple of feints, try and draw the lead, and get Vlasov to overcommit so Joe can get on the inside and do his work. I don't believe Joe can win this fight by playing the boxer. I don't believe he can outbox Maxim Vlasov. First and foremost, Vlasov is the taller, longer man, and all around, as far as I'm concerned, Maxim Vlasov is the better outside fighter. So it's up to Joe Smith Jr. to really make this a fight, and it's up to him to get on the inside and work. If he can do that, he's certainly got a good chance. Maxim Vlasov is a tough guy, but he's been hurt before. He's been down before. I know a couple of those fights were at cruiserweight, but still, Joe Smith Jr. is a massive puncher. If he connects to body or head, he can definitely hurt Maxim Vlasov. But he needs to make a dent early on in this fight because Maxim Vlasov is big. You can't afford to let this guy get in his rhythm. He kind of actually fights in almost like an offbeat rhythm. He's kind of hard to read. He's kind of unpredictable at times. He changes things up. So Joe Smith Jr. needs to really start effectively in this fight, and he needs to force the initiative early on. He needs to make it uncomfortable for Maxim Vlasov. If he does that, I do believe he's got a very good chance in this fight. And all in all, when those moments present themselves of Joe Smith Jr. Having Vlasov stationary, he needs to really work. He can't afford to let those moments go, particularly if Vlasov is playing the boxer in this fight. So it's always hard with Joe Smith Jr. We know what he's going to do, right? He's going to apply that pressure. He's going to look for those big shots. But ultimately, he needs to be a little more cute with it. You know, he needs to set these shots up. He needs to get his way to the inside. That's going to be his main issue in this fight. But if he can do that, he certainly has a real good chance. As for Maxim Vlasov, how does he approach this fight? Well, he is the much taller man. Again, I'm assuming he's longer. He looks longer. So for me, Maxim Vlasov needs to keep this one on the outside. Maxim Vlasov is a guy actually, for a tall, lanky guy, he's actually quite capable on the inside. He can throw short punches up close. He's got some real nice uppercuts up close as well. Maxim Vlasov can fight on the inside, and if he fights Joe Smith on the inside, I'm sure he's going to have success. But to me, that just gives Joe Smith Jr. More of a chance in this fight. So I want to see Maxim Vlasov make Joe Smith Jr. take the lead, and Vlasov needs to try and keep this one on the outside, dictate this fight with the jab, stay moving, maintain range, and basically try and keep Joe Smith Jr. at arm's length. If he can do that, he's certainly got a real good chance. We saw Joe Smith Jr. struggle with the boxing and movement of Dimitri Bivol. Even against Sullivan Barrera, Barrera kept him behind that jab, the long right hand, and Joe Smith Jr. kind of struggled to get up close. So Maxim Vlasov needs to play the boxer in this fight. You know, he needs to keep Joe Smith Jr. behind that jab, and he needs to avoid that wheelhouse of Joe Smith Jr. And if Joe Smith Jr. does get close, you know, don't be afraid to clinch. Joe Smith Jr. is a very strong guy, but Maxim Vlasov is a guy who's been up at cruiserweight. He's competed with Krzysztof Glowacki, a world-class cruiserweight. He's knocked out Rakhim Shakayev, a very big puncher at cruiserweight, who's extremely strong. So in terms of strength, I believe Vlasov actually has the ability and strength to tie up Joe Smith Jr. if he gets too close. So don't be tempted to fight Joe Smith Jr. on the inside. You may have success because Vlasov can fight up close, but again, I just think you're playing a real dangerous game if you engage with Joe Smith Jr. up close. Of course, there's going to be times where he needs to fight Joe up close, but try and minimise those as most as possible. And if that means clinching, then so be it. You know, try and utilise those long arms, that long frame, that strength, and try and tie this guy up. Because if you keep Joe Smith Jr. on the outside, he can be outboxed, and I believe Maxim Vlasov has the technical ability to do that. He just needs to stay disciplined and switched on in this fight. The thing I notice about Maxim Vlasov in fights is there'll be times when he's boxing from range, and other times he'll mix it up and try and fight with you. You know, in this fight, he needs to try and avoid that, in my opinion. Just fight that one style of playing the boxer. And if he does that, I do believe he's got a very good chance of winning this fight. And also, it has to be said, Maxim Vlasov, while I'm advocating him trying to box in this fight, fighting on the outside, at the same time, you can't be too passive, because Joe Smith Jr. takes a lot of discouraging. If you're giving him nothing to think about in regards to what's coming back, then this guy's going to keep on coming forwards. And boxing for 12 rounds against a pressure guy like Joe Smith Jr. is always very hard. So Vlasov needs to make sure to commit to some of these shots on the outside to try and hurt Joe Smith Jr. coming in, similar to how Sullivan Barrera did, and even Dimitri Bivol. So you can't be too passive in this fight. You need to hurt Joe Smith Jr. and get his attention. But not only that, Maxim Vlasov is fighting away from home. We all know who the promotion wants to win this fight. It's Joe Smith Jr. He's the American guy. He's the blue-collar fighter. And theoretically, he's more of a draw than Maxim Vlasov. So not only does Vlasov need to, put some shots on Joe to hurt him, but also to impress the judges. Can't afford to be too passive in this fight. But, like I said earlier in this video at the start, I see this as a genuine 50-50 fight. I believe either guy can win. I wouldn't be shocked if Joe Smith Jr. wins this fight by a knockout or by work rate. But on the flip side, I wouldn't be shocked if Maxim Vlasov outpoints Joe Smith Jr. behind the jab. It's one of those sort of fights. I think the result that is most unlikely would be Maxim Vlasov by stoppage. But I could be wrong. Maxim Vlasov is a big dude. He's got respectable power. Who knows what could happen. But ultimately, I'm sure you guys want my pick. And my official prediction for this fight is actually Joe Smith Jr. on points. I think he might just outwork Maxim Vlasov, land the more telling shots, and I think the judges in this fight may favour his aggression. Obviously, the knockout is possible, but Maxim Vlasov is very tough. He's taken power shots at cruiserweight. Yeah, he's been down, but he's taken these shots and got back up. He's a tough dude. He's big. I'm not sure whether Joe Smith Jr. can actually stop this guy in this fight. It's possible, but I think I'm going to go with Joe Smith Jr. on points via work rate, basically. I could see him getting the respect of Maxim Vlasov, and maybe that puts Maxim Vlasov into more of a passive mode where he doesn't do enough to win the fight. So my official pick is Joe Smith Jr. on points. But it's a hard fight to call. I've been back and forth on this one. Even after this prediction video, I'm going to be back and forth. So there we go, one of those sort of fights. Anyway, share your thoughts below. Who are you picking in this fight? It's been your guy Delboy. Peace.